Hello and welcome to my presentation on our paper, Word Complexity is in the Eye of the Beholder. My name is Sian Gooding and today I'm going to be talking about word complexity and why it's important to view it in a subjective way. So if I showed you a sentence and I asked you to tell me which words you think are complex, it's likely that most people would say zeitgeist. However, if I actually told you something about the specific audience we were targeting, so for instance, if I said, well, this is an advanced speaker of English, very fluent, and their first language is German, it might actually make you reconsider which words are difficult for this particular target group. And the reason why word complexity is so important is that there are many applications that really benefit from being able to reason how difficult words are. So for instance, educational apps, so language learning apps, in text simplification, so if we want to actually simplify text, it's important that we can identify the areas that a particular reader might struggle with, and also readability prediction. So this is really about how readable is a given text. And in our paper, we specifically look at native and non-native audiences. And for the non-native group, we also consider their level of proficiency, so whether they're a beginner, intermediate or advanced, and what bearing this has on the types of words that people find difficult. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk to you about the dataset that we used, I'm going to talk about some of the research questions that we wanted to address, and the overall results. So this dataset was actually collected by Yimam and it was published in 2017. It was also used in the complex word identification shared task. So complex word identification is all about, can we identify words in a sentence that might be difficult or perceived as complex? So in this particular dataset, every sentence was presented to 10 native and 10 non-native speakers of English, and there were multiple languages that this was collected for. We're primarily in this paper looking at the English words. So you can see here there's an example of a sentence. He began postdoctoral research at Helsinki in 2012, and for the given word postdoctoral, 9 out of 10 non-native speakers of English have marked this as a difficult word or a complex word, and 1 out of 10 native. And in this original dataset, there were also proficiency annotations collected. So for the non-native group, they were asked to self-report their proficiency as either beginner, advanced, or intermediate. And these proficiency annotations we release with our dataset, so these haven't previously been released. And this is the data that we work with. So we have these words that have been annotated as complex by different groups. And one of the first things that we wanted to kind of ask was, this is an artistic representation of the research question. So it was, to what extent can the annotations of one subgroup predict the needs of another? Which is to say that if we train a model to predict word complexity with the annotations of one group, does that work well enough for all the other groups, and to what extent can they be used interchangeably? We use the winning shared task system for this. So as I said, there was a shared task with this data and this system was the winner. And this uses 27 traditional features of word complexity in an ensemble approach. And these different features include very traditional measures of word complexity, so things like frequency of a word length, number of syllables, etc., etc. And the main things that we find here are that for each group, the best performing model is trained with the annotations of the target group. And this is intuitive, but it's nice to actually empirically show this and also look at the extent to which these different annotations can predict the needs for different groups. So for instance, we see that for the native group, the best model will be the one that's trained with the complexity annotations of native readers, and the same for non-native. And this also follows for the different proficiencies as well. The second question that we wanted to look at is, okay, well, we can see that once we train a model with these annotations, that the best performing model is trained with the annotations of that group. But why is that the case? So is it because there are certain features that are more important for the target group? Is it because the distributions of features vary depending on the given group? And so you can see in this example, it's interesting that this word postdoctoral has been identified as complex by 9 out of 10 non-native, but only 1 out of 10 native. So what is it about the specific word that has made it more difficult for a non-native audience? And in order to kind of investigate this, we look at the correlations between the absolute number of annotators. So for instance, in this example here, the absolute number would be 9, and the absolute number here would be 1. And we look at the correlations between that and the different numerical features. And I think, to my mind, there are 3 things that are interesting about this. The first is that the native correlations are higher. I think this is because the L1 or first language has been controlled for, and in the future it'd be really nice to look at how different L1s actually impact word complexity. The other thing that's quite interesting is that in traditional kind of papers that look at word complexity, frequency is something that time and time again is brought up as very, very impactful as to how difficult a word is perceived. And in these results, we see that actually frequency doesn't appear in the top 5, but this other measure of frequency, KF-CAT, does. And this is really a measure of the specificity of a word. So this particular feature looks at how many different domains a word occurs in. So something like a very medical piece of terminology that's only used in a very narrow domain would have a lower number, whereas something that was used in everyday or across many different domains would have a higher number. And I think this is interesting because this really points towards the fact that there's a domain element here as well. And then finally, we see that syllables actually correlate highly for native speakers, but not for non-native. And we hypothesize in the paper that this is probably because phonological representations of words are not yet fully formed in beginner or lower level readers. So we also investigate whether the distributions of features vary for different audiences, depending on whether they're native or non-native, and at different proficiencies. And we do find that there are different distributions. So for instance, for advanced readers, there's quite a narrow band of frequencies where if a word is particularly low frequency, it will be marked as complex. Whereas for a beginner, there's actually a much bigger range of frequencies that they find difficult. And part of the reason that this is really useful to know is that if we're doing constrained text generation, which is what this picture here is supposed to represent, then it allows us to actually constrain our text generation models to the particular bands of frequencies that we know particular audiences would find accessible. And then finally, we look at one of the questions we had is, do these models actually make sense in downstream tasks? And some of the downstream tasks that we were looking at were readability. So we actually look at a traditional readability dataset, One Stop English, and this has got text at 3 different levels that have been simplified by teachers. And you can see here, so on the x-axis, these are the 3 different levels of articles. So we have beginner, intermediate and advanced. And on the y-axis, the percentage of words that are identified as complex. So we take our model that was trained on the annotations of beginners, and we take our model that was trained on the annotations of advanced non-native speakers, and we apply these to these 3 different levels of text to kind of sanity check whether they actually make sense in accordance to kind of readability. And so the first thing that we see here is that for both models, they find more words complex the higher the level of the article, which makes sense because the more complex the article, the more likely it would have difficult words in it. The other thing that we see is that for all the different article levels, the beginner model is finding more words complex than the advanced model. And again, intuitively, this makes sense because if you are a beginner, it's more likely that there'll be words that you don't understand across all levels than if you're an advanced reader. And so this was kind of to sanity check that these models were doing something that we would expect on a downstream task. And so to conclude, word complexity is word complexity is subjective and it depends on the target audience. And whilst this is clearly quite an intuitive notion, we feel that this paper is one of the first to kind of empirically investigate that, and we hope that by releasing these annotations with proficiency labels that more people will start to consider this at both modelling word complexity and also in downstream tasks as well. The feature importance and the range of features depends on the target audience, and part of the reason that this is useful to know is if you're doing text generation, it's something that you can consider. And finally, audience-specific models of complex word identification will perform more realistically on downstream tasks because it's more likely that if you're judging readability for a particular subgroup, that you're going to have a kind of better results if you take into consideration what they in particular might find difficult. Thanks very much for listening, and hopefully see you at my Q&A.